Alright, so I'm back, and I looked at the DHS leak, and it appears that the main source of the DHS leak is from this publication called The Intercept, and it's an article entitled Truth Cops. And basically, in this article that they've written, they got some released documents that were released through the Freedom of Information Act through several different politicians, and they also interviewed several federal agents. And the article's pretty comprehensive, and it's talking about the leak and basically how long it's been going on and some other things. I got some quotes here. And then I also I read the entire leaked memo, I guess. I'm not sure if it's leaked or not. Realistically, it seems like it was kind of released on purpose, but who knows. But we can just see some kind of things that are going to be affecting people, especially people that use the internet to try to either do political stuff or just talk about their life. And maybe they have some views that are differing to what the government wants them to have. So first we'll just look at the Intercept article. I just pulled out some quotes here. Like basically they're talking about how, prior to the 2020 election, tech companies including Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Discord, Wikipedia, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Verizon met on a monthly basis with the FBI and CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and other government representatives, which basically is like the FBI, CIA, and a couple other agencies that are listed in this memo. And a couple companies that they didn't list here that are in the memo were Google and the Wall Street Journal also, and the Federal Treasury is also somebody who they were talking to in the memos, but I've got quotes for that, so I'll get to that in a minute. So basically, they're just trying to claim that they're looking for specific types of information on the internet that could be dangerous to, public security, which in some instances I would say that that's good, and other instances it's not so good. We'll see in a second. So it says here that under President Joe Biden, the shifting focus on disinformation has continued in January 2021, and CISA replaced the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force with the Misinformation, Disinformation, and Malinformation team. And that was created to promote flexibility to focus on general MDM, which basically means that they're switching from only looking at foreign, counterintelligence, foreign influence in the media, to including domestic influence in the media, which is questionable. Because, the FBI is trying to block foreign agents from coming into the country. That's one thing, but when it's domestic citizens, it kind of falls out of their purview a little bit. Okay, so here in the article it's saying that the report called on the agency to closely monitor social media platforms of all sizes, mainstream media, cable news, hyperpartisan media, talk radio, and other online resources. And he argued that the agency needed to take steps to halt the spread of false and misleading information. And this is one of the more interesting points about it, is that it's saying that the information could be any information that undermines any key democratic institutions such as courts or other sectors such as financial systems and public health measures. So if you know what's been going on recently, you can see how them saying that if you try to undermine or talk about these things in a way that's not positive, basically is how they're defining it, that you're somehow undermining, these public institutions. And so this kind of gets into the kind of anti-competitive nature of these kind of public-private partnerships where, the government's kind of incentivized to keep these companies in basically afloat because they have this kind of relationship with the government and these corporations where they're very cooperative with the government. Financial institutions are very cooperative with the government, so they're going to get preferential treatment by the government for allowing them to use these third parties as kind of surrogate ways to surveil, censor, and monitor citizens. So down here it says that with research looking at how alleged disinformation can be countered and how quickly messages spread, Jeff Hale, the director of the Election Security Initiative at CISA, recommended the use of third-party information sharing nonprofits as a clearinghouse for information to avoid the appearance of government propaganda. Now, we see that a lot in the memo that they keep on talking about. The memo is basically like notes, or I guess minutes from a meeting or several meetings that they had in between, these government agencies and these private corporations. And they keep kind of reiterating that even though we're telling you what to do, we want to make it look like we're not telling you what to do. And you'll see that when I get to the quotes of the actual. Okay, so this quote right here kind of shows how the government does compartmentalization so they can avoid blame for any of this type of stuff. Because they basically, what they do is they get an idea, because this is very reminiscent of what Cass Sunstein was talking about, but obviously it's not named the same thing, and they keep changing the name of what they're doing. So then when someone identifies what they're doing, then they just change the name. And here's a good example of that. The DHS eventually scrapped the Disinformation Governance Board in August. While free speech advocates cheered the dissolution of the board, other government efforts to root out disinformation have not only continued, but expanded to encompass additional DHS sub-agencies like Customs and Border Protection, which determines whether information about components spread through social media, platforms like Facebook and other social media platforms. So you can see that even though they say they're stopping it, they don't stop, they just change the name. And then again, we can see there's some question about the legality of it, because when they're interviewing an FBI agent, he says, quote, "Man, I don't even know what's legal anymore." And so right there, we can see that there's a huge problem when law enforcement themselves don't know what is or isn't legal, because that's a problem. How can they enforce a law that they don't know? And then we're giving them powers to decide when and where they want to enforce a law, and they don't even know what is or isn't legal. That seems to create a huge problem. And then the article goes into the Hunter Biden laptop and how 50 FBI agents signed off on it saying that it was false information, and that's what allowed Facebook to block the information before the election, even though now it's been determined actually that the information was true and that the laptop is Hunter Biden's laptop and whatever information was on there was on there. And so we can already see that it's a huge problem. First of all, you've got FBI agents that don't even know what's legal. And then second, you have them signing off on things to block information from going out to the public, and they're wrong. They're completely wrong. So that's like 2 strikes right there for this whole entire system, because they don't even know what's legal, and they can't even properly verify what is or isn't true. And so this kind of last quote from this article is that, even though people probably think it's mostly affecting bigger channels and people that have a lot of influence in the media, we can see that in this quote, it says, the Twitter user in question had 56 followers, along with a bio that read, "DM us your weed store location. Hoes be mad, but this is a parody account." Right? So that was it was a 56 follower Twitter profile, and that was flagged by the FBI. Like they're going after pretty much anybody. If you have a 56 follower, does that really seem like their ability to disseminate disinformation or misinformation is very strong. So why would the FBI want to flag them? Doesn't really make sense. Okay, so when you get into the actual leaked meetings, minute meetings, or memo, some of it is memos, some of it is meeting minutes, and you can kind of see what they're talking about because they categorize these three categories of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Now, misinformation and disinformation, I guess you could argue that, the government should be able to allow counter that or at least present information saying, well, this information isn't true because, and then them presenting information that they believe is true. I don't think there's too much of a problem with that. But when you get into the disinformation and specifically the malinformation, there's a lot of them ascribing intent to the information that's being presented on, especially on social media platforms, and especially like in a text form, like someplace like Twitter, where like it would be very difficult to determine the intent of somebody presenting information on those platforms. So like misinformation, they're saying is, just information that's wrong, that somebody is basically, they don't know it's wrong, they're presenting wrong information. And then disinformation is information that's wrong, but then they're ascribing that the person knowingly disseminated this information that is being wrong. And so that puts it in a higher category of risk because they're saying that the person knows that the information is wrong. But how do they know that the person knows? That's very interesting, and I think it would be very difficult for them to prove that unless the person says, hey, I'm knowingly presenting this information that I know is wrong. Because usually people tend not to think that they're wrong when they're presenting information. And okay, disinformation is something that spies do and counterintelligence, stuff like that. Okay. But the malinformation category seems to me to be the most questionable one, because that one is saying that it's truthful information, but it's being presented in a way that is trying to cause, either a disruption or questioning of certain systems and things like that. And so we can already see that category would cause a lot of problems. Like, for example, we've already seen people presenting statistics, either crime statistics, IQ statistics, or a lot of other different types of statistics. And when people don't agree with those statistics, they could be seen as presenting malinformation because they're presenting statistics that are true, but make certain people or groups of people look either in a bad light or something like that, or people could take it in that sense. And then under these laws, that would be considered, bad information or malinformation that you're not allowed to present online, even though it's truthful. And I think that's one of the most dangerous categories, this malinformation category, where presenting truthful information is somehow wrong if you have bad intent. And see, again, they're ascribing intent to this, and it just seems like, I don't know if they should be doing that. So here on page 3 of the meeting minutes, they kind of talk about the way that they're trying to present what they're doing, not as presenting government propaganda, even though everybody knows that Obama got rid of the Smith-Mundt Act whenever he was in office, and that was basically a law that was preventing the government from doing propaganda on their own citizens. And so this program actually goes back 10 years. So if it's 2022 right now, then it would have been started in 2012, and that was when Obama was in office. That's also when Cass Sunstein was suggesting certain things like this, and they also removed the law preventing the government from propagandizing its own citizens. So we can see in this quote right here, it says, members emphasized 2 framing questions for further consideration. One was, how can CISA inspire innovators to partner with the government in a way that catalyzes availability of trusted information without being seen as government propaganda? And then the second question is, what is the balance between social listening, privacy, and protected speech? So you can see right here, they're going into, these ethical questions about how can they work? Because when they're talking about innovators, that basically means these private institutions like Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, places like that. And they're saying, how can we give them information to say, we meaning the government, without it being seen as government propaganda? Well, it's like, but you're doing government propaganda. So it's like this right here in and of itself is kind of off-putting. And then when they say, what is the balance between social listening, privacy, and protected speech? That means how much can the government spy on you in public and use that information basically against you in a court system or something like that. So during each meeting, they kind of list people that are attending the meetings. Like for this meeting, J.P. Chase was there, the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, University of Washington, CISA, and then they have government contractors, Tech, Snap, I don't know who that is. I might look that up later, but basically here on page 5, we can really see how there's a lot of conflict of interest coming up in this, because not only is it the conflict of interest between this public-private partnership stuff, where, like I said before, it's anti-competitive when the government has contracts with certain private institutions and they're incentivized to, pay or give tax benefits to these institutions so that they can stay afloat in the economy because they already have this kind of cooperative agreement with the government, and it's easier for the government to just work with these cooperative companies that are basically going to do what the government says and work with the government as opposed to be private businesses. So it says here that this redacted person obtained permission from another redacted person to use his quote, "Managing mis, dis, and malinformation is my day job. Running elections is my night job." And that's a quote from somebody that's name is redacted, but they're on this board of people. And right there, you can see that's a huge conflict of interest. If the same person that's in charge of managing the information that you receive going into the election is also in charge of running the election, that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem right there. Like, if you can't see how that could lead to corruption very easily or other things, like, why can't they get 2 people at least to do that? I mean, not like 2 people couldn't be corrupted, but at this point, it seems like it's very obvious. Okay, if you're the same person that's in charge of what information voters see, and you're also in charge of running the election, that's a conflict of interest right there. It's a big... Okay, here on page 7, they said, redacted person shared that another redacted person encouraged the subcommittee to discuss their work in the context not that CISA is dealing with disinformation by deciding what is true and pointing people to resources, but that CISA has a mission to ensure national critical functions and secure and resilient, and disinformation poses a threat to CISA's ability to do its mission. So basically, again, here we can see they're trying to reword, because that's part of what this whole meeting minutes is about. It's like them trying to reword things so that they can publicize what they're doing, because they're planning, as you'll see later, they're planning to publicize what they're doing. And that's also kind of why I think that this isn't really a real leak, as opposed to like, because obviously they've been doing this for secret for 10 years, but they've decided to make this information public, and so this is kind of how they're doing it. So, but you can see how it's worded as they're like, well, even though we are the people that are deciding what's true or not, we don't want people to think that we're doing that. And it's just kind of like, okay, I get it. You don't want people to think that you're doing it because it's illegal. Okay. So then again, we got some more meeting participants, Twitter, University of Washington, CISA, J.P. Chase is there a lot, which is very interesting because they're not really in the election thing or anything like that. then here we can see that they got the permission to use the quote. Now they're using the quote, "Responding to misinformation is my day job. My night job is running elections," which just seems like a big conflict of interest. So then here on page 10, we can see some more bullet points that they're trying to carry out. And they're saying that CISA should focus on MD that risk undermining critical functions of American society. Misinformation or disinformation that suppresses election participation or falsely undermines confidence in election procedures and outcomes. So that's questioning elections is considered misinformation or disinformation, or questioning the process of elections. Now we can see that this second bullet point really kind of affects a lot of different groups, where they're saying misinformation or disinformation that undermines critical functions carried out by other key democratic institutions such as courts or other sectors such as the financial system or public health measures. Now we could see how that can affect a lot of different people. Like, for example, in MGTOW, people talk about all the time how the family courts are rigged, and also we'd be considered presenting malinformation when we're showing statistics like that 80-something% of child custody goes to women, and then saying that the family court is rigged. By presenting that information, you're now presenting malinformation under this statute, and that you could be flagged by the FBI for investigation or channel banning or whatever they plan to do with this, because you're presenting malinformation, truthful information, but that's used to undermine the democratic institution of the court. So that falls underneath this. And then again, people that question the financial sector or the financial system, anybody that's saying that, maybe fractional reserve banking is wrong, or anybody that's questioning the role of the Federal Reserve, the money printing, things like that. And then again, you had the CV stuff. So any public health measures, anybody questioning anything having to do with the CV, and you're presenting information that you have from credible sources that counters what the popular belief is now considered malinformation. And you can be subject to these rules and statutes because you're presenting truthful information, but that's trying to undermine what they're doing. Okay, so here on page 15 is kind of where I got the idea that this isn't really a leak as much as just their weird way of introducing this idea to the public after already having it basically going for 10 years. There's no way to get rid of it now. And here it says, subcommittee members continue to discuss how to socialize the recommendations. Some redacted person suggested that CISA socialize the existence and charter of the subcommittees prior to the June meeting, then continue to keep the necessary parties informed as it progresses. So we can see right here that they want to socialize the existence of this. And they've discussed in other parts of this how they want to introduce it to Congress and basically a lot of the civil liberties kind of organizations also. So they were planning on releasing at least some of this information to the public at some point. So again, it kind of makes me question, is this really a leak, or is this kind of like a revelation of the method type of stuff? Okay, here on page 17, we can see that they're using global government language here, where this redacted person is CISA Cybersecurity Advisor Committee, DFO, Stakeholder Engagement Division. So if you don't know what stakeholder capitalism, it's something that's being proposed by the World Economic Forum, which is part of the United Nations, which is part of the global government. And we can see that, people inside the United States government are using that same language, that same talking points that are being presented by the World Economic Forum. Then again here on page 18, we can see again, they're using the stakeholder engagement division. And who are they talking to? They're talking to these large corporations that have, basically monopolies over our society, and they're directly using language that's very similar to the language that's being used by World Economic Forum leaders that are passing down their kind of systems of laws and trying to enforce them onto the national governments. Okay, again here on page 21, we can see they're talking again about the perspective of socializing this subcommittee's work with Congress to prevent outside parties from being blindsided by their efforts. She further suggested the subcommittee reread and refine the recommendations and stressed that the safest ground in elections is the recommendation for CISA to point individuals to authoritative source and to utilize their convening power. She stressed CISA should examine MDM beyond elections. So that's an interesting point too, because you can see this is not just going to be used for elections, just like they started this program to target foreign entities, and now they're targeting domestic entities. So we can see how they'll just keep expanding and expanding. And this is one of the libertarian arguments that why you need small government, because they'll just keep expanding and expanding till it's basically everybody is a criminal and their job is to arrest everybody. See, again here on page 22, they're talking about somebody redacted, reemphasize the recommendation for CISA to direct the public to authoritative sources of information. And who are they to know which sources are authoritative? That's the problem. Once they're saying that we're going to direct you to these authoritative third parties, what's the difference? And we already see there is no difference, and that's why they're saying, well, we have to make it look like there's a difference between us just telling them what to think and there being some third party in between, because realistically the third party is just working for the government, and so they're part of the government. And there's also an interesting term that they used several times in these meetings, which is this term pre-bunking, which instead of debunking claims, they want to pre-bunk claims, which basically means preparing people for arguments that the other side is going to make, and then getting people to not listen to the other side or giving them some type of logic that's going to allow them to, recognize when the other side is giving arguments, instead of having to debunk the arguments once people actually start thinking about what the other side's saying. And again, they're saying that they discussed and brainstormed ways to socialize the subcommittee's work, meaning introduce it to the public. So that's why, again, I don't think that this is a real leak in the way that people think it's like, this is the real secret information. This was kept secret for 10 years. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing. Conspiracy theorists were guessing that's what's going on. People getting banned on YouTube were guessing that something like this was going on. But for 10 years, nobody could say for certain. Nobody had any evidence. And now that they're ready to socialize it with the public, all of a sudden the information just comes out. Okay, here again on page 23, they're going over brainstorming ways in which they can tell people that they're not doing what they're doing, where it says, redacted suggested the group begin their introduction by highlighting the First Amendment and framing their work purely around exercising speech rights of elections officials so not to infringe upon the rights of voters. And redacted said, this is an opportunity to remind the public of CISA's scope, as the First Amendment applies to CISA as a government agency in a way that does not apply to the private sector. But you're working with the private sector. So it's like they're admitting that, they're not allowed to do this, but then they're saying, but it's not us. It's the private institutions that are doing it. And that's exactly what libertarians have been saying, is that, they're working with the government. It kind of defeats the purpose if they're getting special privileges from the government. And again, it's anti-competitive when the government has this close of a relationship with certain industries. And, we see that certain industries get preferential treatment. Certain businesses get preferential treatment. They get, tax write-offs and all types of other stuff because they're complying so much with the government. Okay, so here on page 31, we can see just some more bullet points where they're saying, partnership with media companies in preparation for the election season. CISA should work to ensure specific points of contact are identified to strengthen communication between targets of MDM and the media or the delivery mechanism of attack. So, we can see that they're contacting a lot of different media organizations and social media organizations. And so, to their credit, one person here on page 26 actually argues, I'm not sure if they're arguing against this, but they're at least saying, it's kind of weird that, we're calling information hazardous. It says, she expressed worry about the concept that information itself is threatening and emphasized the need for prefixes of mal, mis, and dis when discussing informational threats. The subcommittee members highlighted that any prefix used as a modifier to describe threats from information distortion could be attacked. Well, yeah, because once you start saying that information is disinformation or malinformation, then you're saying that the intent of the person that's disseminating the information, and that's very difficult to prove. Like if someone's putting up certain statistics about population groups or anything like that, it's factual information. And so if you say they're doing it in a way that's either racist or misogynist or whatever you want to call it, if it's factual information, then these subcategories of information can become under attack because it's debatable. It's very debatable once you start saying factual information needs to be erased because the person that's posting it, their intent is bad. Like that's very hazardous. So here we can kind of see a little bit into the worldview of the people that are working on these cybersecurity, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation projects, because we can see right here the person, Lauren Protentist, has used her preferred pronouns in the email in this memo. So you can see Lauren Protentist, she, her. I mean, I thought in standard English, that was usually how a woman was called, but they need to clarify that. And then see in this memo again, she's using her preferred pronouns, she, her. And in this memo, she's talking about making a point of contact with the Treasury, and she's also wanting to connect with Google. So that they weren't included in the Intercept article, so I just wanted to point that out, that they are talking with Google as well. And then here in this article, in this memo, they're also on page 45, they're also trying to reach out to the Wall Street Journal. And it's interesting that I didn't see an article in the Wall Street Journal about this leak, but that's a different story. Okay, so here on page 46, they're talking about how they've basically had a meeting with all of the media companies, and then the media companies run what they're going to say through this board. And so here we can see that they have this thing, this joint industry statement, which is basically a statement that's going to be made by all of these cooperative media companies that they're supposed to be private companies, but they're running their information past the government to make sure it's okay for them to say what they say and to make sure that it's a cooperative type of thing. So you can see right here the joint statement. I'm not even going to read it, but we can just see that this is the statement that they're going to make, and they're making sure that the government is completely cool with any statement that they're going to make. And the fact is that we can see, companies like Twitter and like Google and Facebook and things like that, we can see their actual misinformation, disinformation standards, and we can see that it far surpasses any free speech laws that are, on the books for American citizens, because, you can see Twitter, for instance, misgendering someone could be considered disinformation or malinformation that's actionable offense, or using certain derogatory terms for people in any type of category, whether it's race, age, gender, sexuality, things that fall clearly under free speech are limited by these companies. And we can see that these companies are clearly working with the government and running all the information that they do past the government, asking the government for permission. And we can see that the government is trying to pretend like it's not working with these companies when they clearly are. They're clearly having meetings. They're clearly discussing, sending money to these companies. As you can see, they're going to contact the Treasury, to print off some money to send to these companies. Okay, so then here on page 48, we can see this thing that they were talking about the portal, where it says, the idea is to establish an centralized portal for reporting disinformation or other issues on platforms so that election officials only have one place to go to report. NASS and NASED support use of this portal have asked CISA to facilitate a meeting with you all to discuss further. Would you and anyone at Facebook you think appropriate have time for a call with these people? So you can see again, they're contacting these people and they want to create a centralized place where only, certain officials or state officials or election officials, and there's also recommendation that police and other people be able to do this too, and they can actually go on and report your information that's on social media to the government, including Twitter accounts with 58 subscribers can be reported to the government, flagged by the government, and put in a file for, possible action. So just from these two kind of article and this minute meeting, we can see that the claims that The Intercept makes in their article are true, that these private companies are clearly working with the government to censor American citizens' free speech. And they're trying to do it in a way using third parties to pretend as if the government's not censoring people. But in actuality, the government is censoring people. And the fact that they're calling this the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee, and it's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure thing, they're basically saying that the internet domain and the domain of social media and the internet in general is a vital part of American society and global society. And the fact that they're willing to ban people outright from using these systems, including these financial systems, because you can see JP Morgan Chase was also at these meetings, is fundamentally going against, free speech. Because it's saying that, well, if you say certain things or do certain things, now you can be completely excluded from the marketplace and from social discourse, and not in a free market sense where if you say something wrong or something that offends enough people that nobody wants to hang out with you, that's one thing. But when the government steps in and says, oh, well, you're wrong, and we're going to block you from being able to talk to people, that's a completely different thing. You see what I'm saying? Like, yeah, okay, if you say something and you piss off everybody and nobody wants to talk to you, that's one thing. But when the government's deciding that, that's a big problem. And we can see that it's a government working with these powerful monopoly type institutions that are getting preferential treatment from the government in a non-competitive way, So when they tell you to go build your own Twitter, build your own Facebook, build your own YouTube, you can't, not only because of the cost of it, but because you end up having to cooperate with the government just to stay afloat, because obviously they're not going to allow people that don't work with the government to get as far as these huge tech monopolies that do work with the government, because you need to get preferential treatment from the government in order to get to be that big of a monopoly in the first place. And that's why people always say, well, if you had a full libertarian society where the government wasn't really doing anything, then just one big monopoly would take over. But it's obvious that when the government does do stuff, then big monopolies take over, because the government is propping up the monopolies through this cooperative type of public-private partnership stuff. So, I mean, what's the argument there? But in any case, we can see that, this is going to be affecting the information that comes out during the elections. And going forward, these subgroups and subcommittees of these same type of things are going to be focusing on other aspects of life. It's not just going to be limited to the election. So that's all I got for this video. Have a good day and go MGTOW.